The smoky haze of the back room at Thompson's saloon hangs thick, a curtain woven from cheap cigar smoke, stale whiskey, and the sweat of desperate men. Jedediah Stone watches his last few chips dwindle, each loss another nail in the coffin of his already failing ranch. He's bankrupt, or near enough as makes no difference, a fact the other players around the poker table seem to relish, their eyes glittering like coyotes sizing up a weakened steer. Tonight the pot is unusual. Alongside a meager pile of coins and a few scrawled IOUs, there's a marker for a piece of property currently held by Silas Blackwood, a man whose cruelty is as renowned as his luck with cards. The property is a girl, young, silent, huddled by the door under the watchful eye of one of Blackwood's thugs. Jed's gaze flicks to her occasionally. She's small, her dress ragged, her eyes wide and dark in a pale face, like a frightened deer trapped in a snare. She never makes a sound, not even when Blackwood's booming voice makes crude jokes at her expense. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. Now the game is down to Jed and Blackwood. The air crackles. Blackwood, fleshy and smug, lays down a full house. A low murmur ripples through the onlookers. Jed stares at his own hand. 2 pair, aces high. Not enough. He can almost taste the bitter ash of defeat. Blackwood leans back, cigarillo clamped in his teeth. Well, Stone, looks like your luck's as barren as your land. He gestures with his chin towards the girl. She's part of the winnings, you know. Quiet one, mute as a post. But strong enough for chores, I reckon. His laugh is a wet, ugly sound. Jed feels a cold knot tighten in his gut, a revulsion that cuts deeper than the loss of the money. He sees the flicker of terror in the girl's eyes as Blackwood speaks of her. He's seen men treat livestock with more consideration. Something in him, something buried deep beneath layers of hardship and cynicism, snaps. He pushes his last few coins forward, not enough to match the IOUs Blackwood has already claimed, certainly not enough for the girl. Then, with a grim set to his jaw, he pulls the deed to his worthless, mortgaged-to-the-hilt ranch from his pocket and throws it onto the table. My land. Against your marker for the girl. A hush falls. Blackwood stares, then slowly smiles, a predator's grin. You'd wager your home for that? He sneers. She ain't worth the dirt under your fingernails, Stone. Jed meets his gaze, unwavering. Call it. The tension is a physical thing. Then, slowly, deliberately, Jed lays down his cards. 2 pair. Not enough for the cash. He pauses, his voice rough. But this here. He taps the deed, is my final stake. For a moment, no one breathes. Then, with a shrug that feigned indifference but carried a spark of triumph, Blackwood spread his hand. He looked at the girl, then at Jed. Some men got no sense. Then he looked at Jed's hand again, then at his own. A flicker of something crossed Blackwood's face. He'd misread. He'd been so sure. Jed didn't have 3 of a kind. He didn't have a straight. But Jed's 2 pair were aces and 8s. Blackwood's full house was jacks over 3s. Jed hadn't been bluffing about his hand being weaker for the main pot, but he'd played his wager on the girl separately. He'd lost the monetary pot to another player who had a better hand than Blackwood's full house, a quiet man who quickly scooped his winnings. The side bet for the girl, however, was between Jed and Blackwood, based on the strength of their hands relative to each other, a foolish, desperate move if Jed truly believed his hand weak. But Blackwood, overconfident, hadn't scrutinized Jed's play closely enough for that specific, strange wager. Or perhaps, more likely, the chaos of the multiplayer pot and side bets had confused the brutish Blackwood. The rules of this desperate late-night game were often fluid, decided by intimidation as much as by Hoyle. Jed had, in essence, bought her, his aces and eights beating Blackwood's hubris for this one, specific, human stake. And with 3 words, quiet but carrying the weight of iron, aces high win, from the impromptu dealer, a grizzled old prospector, his life and hers were irrevocably changed. Jedediah Stone was a man carved from the unforgiving landscape he inhabited. His ranch, a sprawling tract of sun-baked earth and stubborn rock in the far corner of the territory, had been his father's pride, but years of drought and bad luck had leached the life from it, just as they had leached the hope from Jed. He was lean, weathered, his hands calloused and scarred from endless work that yielded little more than dust and debt. Loneliness was a constant companion, as silent and persistent as the wind that whispered through the skeletal branches of the cottonwoods by the dry creek bed. He'd come to the poker game as a last, desperate gamble, hoping to win enough to save his land from the bank, a fool's errand he'd known even as he sat down. Losing the money was expected, winning the girl was not. He didn't know her name, only that she was mute, her silence as profound and unsettling as the vast, empty plains. As he led her out of the saloon, leaving Blackwood sputtering curses and threats, he felt the weight of judgmental eyes on his back. He could hear the whispers already starting, branding him a fool, or worse. The girl, for she was scarcely more than that, perhaps 16, 17 at most, flinched at every loud sound, every sudden movement. Her eyes, huge in her thin face, were pools of unspeakable fear. He wondered what horrors had silenced her, what terrors had etched such a permanent shadow into her gaze. He imagined her past was a litany of cruelties, leading her from one careless hand to another, culminating in being a poker chip in a smoky back room. The journey to his ranch was a long, silent one. He rode his aging gelding, Buck, while she walked beside him, her bare feet stumbling on the rough track. He'd offered her a ride, but she'd shrunk away from his outstretched hand as if expecting a blow, so he hadn't pressed. The sun beat down mercilessly. He gave her his canteen, and she drank hesitantly, her eyes never leaving his face. His ranch was 2 days' ride from the dubious civilization of the nearest town, a collection of false-fronted buildings and hard-bitten souls. Isolation was both its curse and its blessing. Here, at least, they would be away from prying eyes and wagging tongues for a while. When they finally arrived, the sight of the dilapidated ranch house and decaying outbuildings seemed to make her shrink even further into herself. It wasn't much, he knew. A small 2-room cabin, a listing barn, and corrals that needed mending. Dust was everywhere, a fine, gritty powder that coated everything. He gestured towards the cabin. "You can sleep in there, in the main room. I'll take the lean-to." He tried to keep his voice gentle, but it came out gruff, unused to softness. She stared at him, then at the cabin, her expression unreadable. That first night, he lay awake in the cramped lean-to, listening to the silence from the main room. It was a different kind of silence than he was used to. His solitude had always been empty. This silence was filled with another person's fear, another person's pain. He thought of Silas Blackwood, his leering face and possessive words. Blackwood wouldn't forget this. He was the kind of man who nursed a grudge, who saw people as possessions. Jed knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that Blackwood would likely come looking for what he considered his. The town, too, would buzz with gossip. A bankrupt rancher and a mute girl won in a poker game. It was the stuff of lurid speculation. He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness rise in him, an emotion so unfamiliar it startled him. He had nothing, was nothing, but he wouldn't let them harm her. The next morning, he found her huddled in the furthest corner of the main room, her eyes wide with a hunted look. He'd made a small fire in the hearth, boiled some coffee, and fried a few strips of bacon he'd been saving. He set a plate of food and a tin cup of coffee on the rough-hewn table, then retreated outside to give her space. When he returned an hour later, the food was untouched. He sighed. This was going to be harder than he thought. He spent the day mending a broken fence line, acutely aware of her presence. She stayed near the cabin, a small, still figure against the vastness of the prairie. Occasionally, he'd see her watching him, her gaze intense, searching. He tried to act as if her presence was normal, going about his chores with a deliberate slowness, hoping to convey that he meant her no harm. He spoke to Buck, his voice low and steady, hoping the sound of it, even if not directed at her, might be reassuring. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, he approached the cabin cautiously. He'd shot a rabbit earlier and stewed it with some wild onions. The aroma, meager as it was, filled the small space. He saw her sitting by the cold hearth, her arms wrapped around her knees. He ladled some stew into a bowl and placed it on the table, along with a piece of hardtack. "Food," he said simply, then backed away to his own spot by the door. He ate slowly, watching her from the corner of his eye. After a long while, she uncurled herself and crept towards the table. Her movements were like those of a wild thing, ready to bolt at the slightest threat. She picked up the spoon with trembling fingers and took a tentative bite. Then another and another, until the bowl was empty. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. A few days later, Jed decided they needed supplies. His larder was nearly bare, and the girl, he still didn't know her name, and felt a strange reluctance to simply assign her one. Needed proper shoes and perhaps a dress that wasn't in tatters. The thought of taking her into town filled him with apprehension. He knew the kind of reception they would receive. As they rode, her perched awkwardly behind him on Buck this time, a concession born of her exhaustion after he found her collapsed near the woodpile. He tried to prepare himself. "Towns, not always friendly," he said, his voice rough. "People stare, talk, don't you mind them." She made no sign she'd heard, her small hands clutching his shirt so tightly her knuckles were white. The town of Redemption was as judgmental as he'd anticipated. As they dismounted in front of Henderson's Mercantile, a hush fell over the boardwalk. Faces peered from windows, conversations died mid-sentence. He felt their stares like physical blows, but he kept his face impassive, his hand resting lightly on the girl's shoulder to guide her inside. Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose face looked perpetually soured by disapproval, pursed her lips when she saw them. "Stone," she said, her voice frosty. "Didn't expect to see you. Or your companion." Jed ignored her tone. "Need some flour, beans, coffee, and a pair of sturdy shoes for the girl. A dress, too, if you have anything simple." Mrs. Henderson's eyes raked over the girl, lingering on her ragged clothes and bare, dusty feet. "She don't speak, does she? Heard Blackwood won her in a game, then you took her off him. Some say you stole her." "I won her fair," Jed said, his voice low and dangerous, "and her not speaking is her own business. Now, the shoes." Reluctantly, Mrs. Henderson produced a few pairs of worn but serviceable boots. Jed knelt, gently taking one of the girl's feet in his hand. It was small, bruised, and surprisingly delicate. He found a pair that seemed to fit, then selected a plain dark calico dress. As he paid, using the last of his poker winnings, and a promise of future credit he wasn't sure he could honor. He felt the weight of the town's condemnation. Outside, a group of loafers by the saloon watched them, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and contempt. One of them, a crony of Blackwood's named Pike, swaggered over. "Well, well, Stone, enjoying your prize?" Pike jeered, his eyes lingering on the girl in a way that made Jed's fists clench. "Blackwood ain't too happy you spirited her away. Says he's got unfinished business with her." The girl flinched, pressing closer to Jed. He stepped slightly in front of her. "My business with Blackwood is settled. This girl is under my protection. You tell him that." Pike spat on the ground. "Protection? A bankrupt rancher like you? What can you offer her? Blackwood will be coming for his property, Stone. You can count on it." Jed met Pike's gaze coolly. "She ain't property, and he knows where to find me." He turned, guiding the girl back to Buck, acutely aware of every hostile stare. The ride back to the ranch was filled with a grim silence. He had publicly claimed her, thrown down a gauntlet. The die was cast. That night, he found an old, smooth piece of slate and a nub of charcoal he used for marking timber. He set them on the table before her. If you want to write or draw anything." He felt clumsy, foolish. She stared at the slate, then up at him, her eyes wide and questioning. He didn't press, he just left it there. A week passed, then another. A fragile routine began to establish itself on the Stone Ranch. Jed worked from sunup to sundown, trying to breathe life back into the parched land. He cleared new ground for a small vegetable patch, repaired the leaky roof of the barn, and spent hours hauling water from the nearly dry well. The girl, whom he had started to think of as Ilara, a name he'd once heard his mother mention, belonging to a distant star, something quiet and far away, remained mostly silent and watchful. But small changes were happening. She no longer flinched every time he came near. She started leaving the cabin during the day, sitting in the sliver of shade by the porch, mending his torn shirts with tiny, almost invisible stitches. Her skill with a needle was remarkable. He found she had a way with animals too. Buck, usually cantankerous with strangers, would nuzzle her hand. Even the scrawny chickens seemed to follow her around. One sweltering afternoon, he returned from a fruitless hunt, tired and disheartened. As he approached the cabin, he saw Ilara kneeling by the small patch of earth he'd cleared, a makeshift water bucket beside her. She was carefully tending to a few struggling tomato seedlings he'd planted, her brow furrowed in concentration. A strange warmth spread through his chest. It was the first truly voluntary act of contribution he'd seen from her, a small sign that perhaps this desolate place was becoming something other than a prison in her eyes. He began to talk to her more, not expecting replies, but simply filling the silence. He told her about the ranch, his father, his failed dreams. He spoke of the changing seasons, the habits of the prairie creatures, the names of the distant constellations he sometimes watched from his lean-to. He didn't know if she understood or even listened, but it felt important to treat her as more than just a silent presence. One evening, he found a drawing on the slate. It was a crude but recognizable sketch of Buck, his head cocked inquisitively. Jed smiled. "That's good. That's real good, Ilara." He used the name aloud for the first time. She looked up at him, a flicker of something, surprise, recognition, in her eyes, before she quickly looked down again, a faint flush rising on her cheeks. The discoveries about each other were small, like pebbles gathered one by one. He learned she was terrified of thunderstorms, cowering in the corner, her body trembling, until he sat quietly in the room with her, not touching, just present, until the storm passed. He noticed she would hum, a tiny, almost inaudible sound, when she was engrossed in her mending or tending her small garden. She, in turn, saw him share his last piece of bread with a stray dog that wandered onto the property, his rough hands gentle as he stroked its matted fur. She saw the lines of worry etched on his face when the well ran lower, and the quiet despair in his eyes when a dust storm threatened their meager crops. Their fragile peace was shattered one morning by the arrival of two riders. Jed recognized them instantly, Pike and another of Blackwood's men. Ilara, who had been scattering feed for the chickens, froze, then darted into the cabin like a startled rabbit. Jed met the men by the porch, his stance deceptively casual, his hand near the old Colt revolver he always wore. "Stone," Pike said, his voice insolent. "Mr. Blackwood sent us. He wants his girl back." "I told you," Jed said, his voice dangerously soft. "She's not his, and she's not going anywhere." "He ain't asking," Pike sneered, his hand straying towards his own gun. "He's telling. He says that poker game was a sham, that you cheated him." "He's a liar," Jed stated flatly. "He lost fair and square. Now get off my land." "Blackwood's got friends, Stone. Important friends. The sheriff in Redemption, for one. He can make things real uncomfortable for a broke-down rancher like you. Especially one harboring stolen property." Pike's eyes flicked towards the cabin door. "Just give her up. It ain't worth the trouble." Jed's jaw tightened. The thought of Ilara back in Blackwood's clutches, enduring whatever horrors he would inflict, was unbearable. "I said, get off my land." His voice was cold steel. Pike hesitated, clearly weighing the odds. Jed might be bankrupt, but he had the look of a man who wouldn't be pushed. Finally, with a muttered curse, Pike reined his horse around. "You'll regret this, Stone. Blackwood always gets what he wants." As they rode off, Jed let out a slow breath. He turned towards the cabin. Ilara was standing in the doorway, her face ashen, her eyes wide with terror. He saw the tracks of silent tears on her dusty cheeks. He went to her, stopping a few feet away. "You're safe here, Ilara," he said, his voice gentler than he intended. "I won't let him take you." She stared at him, her chest heaving. Then, to his utter astonishment, she took a hesitant step towards him and pressed the slate into his hands. On it, she had drawn a single, stark image, a man's heavy boot stepping on a small, delicate wildflower. Beneath it, a single, shakily drawn word, "No." He understood. This was her defiance, her plea. He nodded slowly. "No," he agreed, "he won't." The threat from Blackwood hung over them like a storm cloud. Jed knew Pike's words weren't idle. Blackwood was a man of influence, at least in the corrupt corners of the territory. He could easily stir up trouble, legal or otherwise. The incident had deepened Jed's resolve, but it had also ignited a new fear, not for himself, but for Ilara. He found himself watching her more, noticing the way her hands stilled when she heard riders in the distance, the way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon. He was developing feelings for her that went far beyond responsibility or pity. He admired her quiet strength, her resilience in the face of unimaginable trauma. He felt a fierce desire to protect not just her body, but the fragile flicker of hope he sometimes saw in her eyes. Ilara, too, was changing. The constant fear was still there, a shadow in the background, but it no longer consumed her. She began to explore the ranch a little further, venturing down to the almost dry creek bed, where she found a few persistent wildflowers. She would pick them and arrange them in an old tin can on the cabin table. She started leaving small, shy offerings for Jed, a perfectly ripe wild berry, a smooth, interesting stone. Communication through the slate became more frequent. She drew pictures of things she saw, animals, plants, the changing sky, She even attempted to write words, copying them from an old almanac Jed had. Her progress was slow, laborious, but it was progress. One evening, as a chill wind whistled around the eaves of the cabin, Jed found her staring into the flames of the small fire, her face etched with a profound sadness. He sat down not far from her, content to share the silence. After a long while, she picked up the slate and began to draw. It wasn't one of her usual pictures of the ranch. This was different. Darker. She drew a large, menacing figure of a man, his face obscured by shadow, but his hands large and cruel. Then she drew a smaller figure, a girl, cowering. There were bars, like a cage. Her hand trembled as she drew, and when she was finished, she looked at Jed, her eyes filled with a pain so raw it took his breath away. He didn't need words to understand the horror of her past, the life she had escaped, the reason for her silence. Blackwood. It had to be Blackwood, or someone like him. He reached out, slowly, and gently took the slate from her. He wiped it clean. Then he looked her in the eyes. "He will never touch you again, Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear it." She searched his face, her gaze unwavering. Then, slowly, a single tear traced a path down her cheek. But this time, it wasn't a tear of terror. It felt like a tear of release. The next day, Jed made a decision. Blackwood wouldn't give up. The whispers from town, carried by the occasional passing trapper or prospector, confirmed that Blackwood was stirring up trouble, claiming Jed was holding the girl against her will, that she was his indentured servant who had run away. The local sheriff, a man known to be in Blackwood's pocket, had even sent a curt, vaguely threatening note demanding Jed present himself and the girl for questioning. Jed knew that simply defying Blackwood wouldn't be enough. He needed something more, something to make his protection of Alara undeniable, legally sound. He found her by the creek bed, where she was trying to coax a few stubborn blades of grass to grow. He sat down beside her. "Alara," he began, his voice hesitant. "Blackwood, he's not going to leave us be. He's telling folks you belong to him." She looked down, her small hands clenching. "The sheriff, he's listening to him." He took a deep breath. There's a way to stop him, to make sure he can't ever claim you." He paused, struggling for the right words. If you were my wife, legally, then he'd have no claim. No one would." Ilara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something unreadable. He rushed on. "It wouldn't have to be a real marriage. Not in that way. Not unless you wanted it to be. It would be for protection. My name, Stone. It would be your shield, for real, legally." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. He could see the fear warring with something else in her eyes. He had no idea what she was thinking, if she even understood the implications. He felt a pang of guilt. Was he just replacing one form of ownership with another? But then he thought of Blackwood's cruel face, the drawing on the slate, and his resolve hardened. This was the only way. "We'd have to go to a bigger town," he continued, "to a proper preacher or a judge. Make it official. It's a long ride. And Blackwood might try to stop us." He looked at her, his heart aching with a tenderness that surprised him. "It's your choice, Alara. I won't force you. But I don't see another way to keep you safe." She sat in silence for a long time, her gaze fixed on the dry earth. Then, slowly, she reached for a smooth, flat stone and a piece of charcoal she often carried in her pocket. She began to draw. She drew 2 stick figures, one taller, one smaller, standing side by side. Then she drew a circle around them, a circle of protection. She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. He nodded. "Yes, a circle of protection. She hesitated for another moment, then with a trembling hand, she drew a tiny, almost invisible line connecting the hands of the two figures. She looked at him again, a fragile hope dawning in her eyes. "Yes, Ilara," he said, his voice husky. "Yes." They left before dawn 2 days later, Jed on Buck and Ilara on an old, gentle mare Jed had bartered from a passing peddler some months back, trading a mended saddle and the last of his decent tools. He'd chosen the town of Clearwater, a good 3 days' ride, known for its fair-minded circuit judge who was due to arrive soon. Jed carried his Colt, and an old Spencer rifle was slung in its scabbard on Buck's saddle. He didn't expect trouble, not yet, but he was prepared. Ilara was dressed in the new calico dress, her feet shod in sturdy boots. A small bundle tied behind her saddle held her slate, her charcoal, and a few precious wildflowers she'd pressed between the pages of the almanac. The first 2 days of their journey were uneventful, the vast, empty prairie stretching around them. They spoke little, the silence between them comfortable now, filled with unspoken understanding. Jed found himself watching Ilara, the way she sat her horse with a quiet grace, the way her eyes, though still wary, now held a spark of curiosity as she observed the new landscape. He realized with a jolt that he wasn't just doing this to protect her. He was doing it because the thought of a life without her quiet presence by his side was now unimaginable. His bankrupt ranch, his failed dreams, they seemed less important than the safety and well-being of this silent girl who had somehow, inexplicably, found her way into the desolate corners of his heart. On the 3rd day, as they neared Clearwater, trouble found them. They were riding through a narrow ravine when 3 riders emerged from behind a rocky outcrop, blocking their path. Jed's hand went instantly to his Colt. It was Blackwood, flanked by Pike and another of his thugs. "Well, Stone," Blackwood sneered, his eyes glittering with malice. "Fancy meeting you here. Taking my property for a little trip, are we?" Ilara gasped, a tiny, choked sound, and instinctively moved her mare closer to Buck. "She's not your property, Blackwood," Jed said, his voice level, though his heart was pounding, "and she's not going with you." "Oh, I think she is," Blackwood said, his smile unpleasant. "I've got a bill of sale, you know. Says she's mine, bought and paid for long before you ever laid eyes on her. You stole her, Stone, and I'm here to reclaim what's mine." He nodded to Pike. "Get her." Pike started to move his horse forward, but Jed drew his Colt, the metallic click echoing in the confined space. "Stay where you are, Pike." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think that pop gun scares me, Stone? There's 3 of us. You're a broke rancher playing hero. She's just a mute half-wit. Not worth dying for." "She's worth more than you'll ever be, Blackwood," Jed retorted, his eyes blazing. "And she's soon to be my wife. We're on our way to Clearwater to see the judge." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Wife? You think that little trick will save her? Or you?" He made a motion, and suddenly Pike and the other man drew their guns. "I don't think you'll be making it to Clearwater, Stone." Time seemed to slow. Jed knew he couldn't take all 3 of them. He was a fair shot, but they had the numbers. He tensed, ready to make his stand, to sell his life dearly if it meant buying Ilara even a few moments to escape. Then something extraordinary happened. Ilara, who had been frozen with terror, suddenly urged her mare forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Jed. Her face was pale, but her eyes, fixed on Blackwood, blazed with a defiant fire Jed had never seen before. She reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out something small and dark. It was a locket tarnished with age. With trembling fingers, she opened it and held it out towards Blackwood. Blackwood stared, his smug expression faltering. "What in the—" Ilara didn't speak. But her meaning was clear. Jed could see, even from his angle, that one side of the locket held a miniature portrait of a stern-looking woman in fine clothes. The other side, he couldn't quite make it out. Blackwood's face contorted. "Where did you get that?" he snarled, his voice losing some of its bluster. Ilara pointed at herself, then at the locket, then made a sweeping gesture that seemed to encompass a past Jed could only guess at. She then pointed accusingly at Blackwood, her small hand stabbing the air. That proves nothing," Blackwood blustered, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes now. Pike and the other man looked uneasy, their guns wavering slightly. "What is it, Ilara?" Jed asked softly. She looked at him, then back at Blackwood, and with a sudden, sharp movement, she threw the locket at Blackwood's feet. Then, she did something that stunned everyone, including Jed. She opened her mouth, and a sound emerged, not a word, but a cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and pain, raw and animalistic. It was a sound that spoke of years of suppressed horror, of unspeakable suffering. It was the sound of a soul breaking free. The cry seemed to unnerve Blackwood and his men more than any gunshot could have. They stared at Ilara, at this mute girl who had suddenly found a voice, however terrible. "She's mad," Pike stammered, backing his horse away. Just then, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them. 4 riders, wearing the badges of the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department, rounded the bend. The lead rider, a tall, stern-faced man, took in the scene at a glance. Jed and Ilara, Blackwood and his men with guns drawn. "What's going on here, Blackwood?" the sheriff demanded, his voice carrying authority. Blackwood, flustered, tried to regain his composure. "Sheriff, thank goodness. This man, Stone, he's abducted my indentured servant." "That's a lie." Jed cut in. "This lady is Ilara, and she is to be my wife. Blackwood has been tormenting her, claiming she's his property. She came with me willingly, to escape him." The sheriff looked from Blackwood to Jed, then to Ilara. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were resolute. She pointed to the locket on the ground, then to Blackwood, and shook her head vehemently, making a gesture of disgust. The sheriff dismounted, picked up the locket, and examined it. His expression grew grim. "This locket bears the crest of the Beaumont family, from back east," he said, his eyes hard on Blackwood. "There were inquiries about a missing Beaumont daughter some years back. Last seen in the company of a man fitting your description, Blackwood, who called himself a guardian." Blackwood turned a sickly shade of green. That's preposterous. A coincidence." "Perhaps," the sheriff said, his voice like ice. "But fraud, abduction, and holding someone against their will are serious charges, especially if that someone is from a prominent family. We'll be looking into this, Blackwood, thoroughly." He turned to his deputies. "Escort Mr. Blackwood and his associates back to Clearwater. They have some questions to answer." Pike and the other man looked ready to bolt, but the deputies were efficient. Disarmed and crestfallen, Blackwood was led away, sputtering protests and threats that no one heeded. Jed let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He looked at Ilara. She was trembling, but she stood tall, her eyes fixed on the retreating figures of her tormentors. He reached out and gently took her hand. It was cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "You did it, Ilara," he said softly, his voice filled with awe. "You saved us." She looked at him, and for the first time, a small, hesitant smile touched her lips. It was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. In that moment, Jedediah Stone, the bankrupt rancher, knew he was the richest man in the world. The marriage ceremony, when it took place before Judge Harrison later that day, was simple and brief. But as Jed slipped a plain gold band, bought with the last of his money, a ring that had once been his mother's, onto Alara's finger, and as she looked up at him, her eyes shining with a newfound trust, he knew this was the most profound vow he would ever make. He had given her his name, and in return, she had given him back his life. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of peace, of relief, of a future tentatively embraced. The looming threat of Blackwood had been neutralized, his power broken by Alara's courage and the unexpected revelation of her past. Investigations in Clearwater would later confirm her identity as Alara Beaumont, daughter of a wealthy Eastern family, who had been abducted as a young girl by a con man, Silas Blackwood, after her parents' untimely death. He had kept her isolated and controlled her inheritance, her mutism a result of trauma and his cruel manipulations. The law would deal with Blackwood now. Back at the ranch, the sparse cabin no longer felt like a refuge of last resort, but a home. Alara moved with a new confidence, a lightness in her step. The shadow of fear in her eyes had begun to recede, replaced by a growing serenity. She still used the slate to communicate, but her drawings were brighter, filled with images of their life on the ranch, Buck grazing contentedly, the chickens scratching in the yard, the two of them working side by side in the small garden, which, against all odds, was beginning to flourish under her patient care. One evening, Jed sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. Alara came to sit beside him, a comfortable silence between them. She leaned her head gently against his shoulder, a gesture of affection that filled him with a deep, quiet joy. He put his arm around her. The ranch was still poor, the work still hard, but it no longer felt like a burden. It was their place, their sanctuary, built not on wealth or luck, but on courage, resilience, and a bond forged in the crucible of shared hardship. She touched his hand, then picked up her slate. She drew a picture of the cabin, with smoke curling from the chimney. Then she drew two figures standing in the doorway, holding hands. Beside it, she carefully, painstakingly wrote two words, "Our home." Jed looked at her, his heart full. He had won a mute girl in a poker game, a girl deemed worthless by the world. He had given her his name as a shield. But Alara Beaumont Stone had given him so much more. She had shown him the meaning of courage, the resilience of the human spirit, and the quiet power of a love that needed no words. He watched her as she hummed softly, tending to a pot of wildflowers on the porch railing, her face illuminated by the soft twilight, and knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. His bankrupt ranch now held a treasure beyond all measure. He hadn't just found a companion, he had found his heart, and a reason to believe in new beginnings, even in the harshest of lands. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.